Drew here, and I really have to ask, why is Stephen fighting Gilead? Why doesn't he just want to be in Gilead as one of the soldiers or the commanders, since he, basically has the same thing going on in his relationship with Janine here, as June very astutely points out when she says, you can stay here and be of Stephen. I mean, I feel like he would have fit in quite well in Gilead for the most part. But this episode, entitled Chicago, was another solid installment of Handmaid's Tale. I think that the show continues to find a pretty good balance of having the sober kind of contemplation that this show has been known for, the character moments, but still moving things forward a little bit more clearly, but also having just like exciting things happen in every episode. So you feel like you had a full meal, a full course each week. This episode, if there's one thing I think that people are going to be thinking about, it kind of served as it's seemingly a farewell to Janine. We didn't see her body, so obviously there's always the chance that she's still alive. If you don't have a body, there's a chance. And, I wouldn't be surprised if they have her disappear all season, and then like in season 5, they pop in on her and she's still there hanging out with Stephen, that it turns out that she survived and she stayed there after all. But if this was a farewell to Janine, then I would argue it was a pretty good one. I think that this episode highlighted her relationship with June. And you could argue that if they were going to kill this character, they could have had it happen in episode 3 when Alma and a lot of the other handmaids died as they tried to outrun the train. But given the importance of this character compared to some of the other characters, I think it was a good idea to give her a little bit more time to bid farewell, if that's what this was. And this episode really highlighted her unconditional love for June, because last episode we saw this moment where June revealed to Janine that she had given up the handmaids, and ultimately this resulted in their deaths, and she had done it to protect her daughter. And in a different relationship in this show, you would kind of expect Janine to not be talking to June or to be furious with her, and there would be this tension between them. But not so here, because Janine seemingly understands June, even though Janine can come off as simplistic and as someone who doesn't really understand the situation and what's going on. There is a real sense, I think, in which she gets June, in which she understands her. And my wife has said something about this show that I really, really agree with, which is that it really gets the strength of women, and I argue that it portrays this friendship in a particularly strong way. I think there's a lot of, sci-fi shows and other shows where you have these strong women characters, but they kind of go the route of, they're strong characters in a way that doesn't feel, and there's debate on this, I get it, but distinctly feminine. And I would argue that there's something different about the portrayal in Handmaid's Tale that just feels more authentic to me. And in this episode, the tragedy is you see June leaving because she feels that she needs to be in the resistance. She needs to be somewhere where she's fighting the enemy. And Janine initially decides to stay behind because she's comfortable here, even though she's kind of having a break from reality and what her relationship with Stephen is. You can still see that she would probably be fine with it. But June, she needs to be in the resistance. She needs to be actively fighting the enemy. And this has kind of been a theme that's come out a lot this season. Is it okay to just stand on the sidelines and just enjoy, your little bit of nothing and just be happy that you're free to enjoy it? Or do you need to be fighting tyranny? Do you need to be standing up to it? And this is, a constant problem for people living under the rule of dictators today, I feel. And the tragedy here is that Janine ultimately does follow June, and she tells her, I feel safe with you. And of course, she's not safe with June because June really isn't able to protect anyone. Everyone who follows her, as another handmaid tells Nick this episode, ends up dying or on the wall. And it's this tragedy that June is already dealing with the fact that she got these other handmaids killed, and now she seems to have gotten Janine killed. So that will be hard for her to deal with. It's interesting that at the end of this episode, she encounters Samira Wiley's Moira. They've really gone out of their way to have June encounter like all the main cast this season, and they've done some plot contrivances to make it happen. I'll allow it because I get it. They wanted to have June meet up with Commander Joseph, Aunt Lydia, Nick. It'll be interesting to see how her meeting with Moira plays out next episode, because as we've seen, Moira has some resentment towards June for kind of handing her daughter and being like, oh, and by the way, I'm going back to fight. Have fun in Canada. So it'll be interesting to see how this dynamic plays out. Moira is not Janine. There's going to be some tension here. Otherwise, this episode, I kind of alluded to this in my intro, but I feel that it's interesting the way that they portrayed Janine's relationship with Stephen this episode. Stephen obviously is kind of taking advantage of his position in the resistance to force women essentially to have sex with him so that they can have a place to stay. And it's interesting because, as one of you pointed out in the comments, this isn't all that different from what the decisions that women have often had to make throughout history. You look at a lot of the relationships that women entered into, including marriages throughout history, and it oftentimes wasn't for love. It was oftentimes for some practical purpose that they, needed something. They're like, I want a family, I want stability, I want a home, therefore I'm going to marry someone that I may not be attracted to, may have no love for. And it's interesting how they contrast this in the opening scene with June's relationship with Luke, where it obviously is a loving relationship that is completely consensual. And the way that it's established this episode, it seems that, Janine to a certain extent is enjoying being with Stephen. She even describes the relationship as completely consensual to June's eye roll. But from her perspective, it is, because she has the ability to walk away. She could leave the group if she wanted. No one is going to hold her and forcibly make her have sex with Stephen. But she is choosing to do it because of getting what she wants. So it's a kind of prostitution, arguably. And arguably, many marriages are a type of prostitution. Not going to get into that anymore, but it's an interesting comparison being made. I think that they kind of had some of the plot lines this episode take a step back. I feel like the military tactics on display, the plans, they feel very Mockingjay. They don't feel like actual military strategies to me. They feel like something that you would see in, like I said, Mockingjay, or something where the author isn't really a military tactician. We see, though, in the plot line with Commander Joseph and with Aunt Lydia, I feel that these two plot lines have kind of taken a step back. It kind of seemed like in episode 3, these two characters were back in their positions of power. And in fairness, from June's perspective, it might seem that way since they did have power over her. But within their own storylines, they're very much on the outs. And Commander Joseph, he pitches his idea to these leaders of Gilead, and they, simply shut him down, saying, we're not going to do what you're suggesting, which is to have a ceasefire and to try to get sanctions lifted from Gilead by showing some humanitarian compassion for the people that they're fighting on the border. But ultimately, he is able to get them to do what he wants, but only after Aunt Lydia comes to him and tries to blackmail him, and then they end up teaming up. He uses her network of handmaids to get dirt on the people who were rejecting his idea previously and uses it to get them to go along with the plan. And this is an interesting team up to a certain extent. I feel that you couldn't have two more diametrically opposed characters in this show. You've got the world-weary, very cynical, but crafty Commander Joseph, and then you've got Aunt Lydia, who, she's intelligent in her own way, but she's very, very much a part of the system, and even though she's someone who's oppressed by the system, as we see at the beginning of this episode, that once she has no purpose, there's not really anything for her to do. She has no autonomy, but she's someone who still very much supports the system and wants to see it thrive, whereas Commander Joseph, he's willing to allow the system to continue because he doesn't want to die, and he wants to be, and he's enjoyed some benefit from it, but he's also someone who would like to see Gilead change. So it's going to be interesting to see how these two butt heads going forward, or how their dynamic develops. But I thought it was, side note, I thought it was really interesting how they had this moment where after Aunt Lydia gets reinstated over some handmaids, she's talking about how handmaids never walk alone. And you see this theme in the relationship with June and Janine this episode. And obviously, it's not an ideal thing when it comes to handmaids because this is an enforced thing. But when it comes to June and Janine, it's, speaking to the beauty of their friendship, that June has someone who will stick by her, or had someone potentially who would stick by her through thick and thin. But getting back to the story with Commander Joseph and Aunt Lydia, I think the revelation, that they're going to have the humanitarian aid and then they're going to have them come out and bomb them, this just really felt like Mockingjay to me. I couldn't get around that mentally. I was like, man, this is Mockingjay. So I appreciated the slow expansion of the world this episode. I also thought it was noteworthy that, even though we see this character of Stephen who, manipulated Janine into having sex with him, even if she decides ultimately that she's enjoying it and that she's content to continue doing it, we also have this character, I think his name was Brad or Chad, who showed interest in June, but he was willing to help her without expecting, sexual favors from her in return. And I think this goes to the conversation that June had with Mrs. Keyes in episode 2, where she said that she thinks that there are good and bad men all over, but Gilead makes it really hard. So those are my thoughts on this episode of Handmaid's Tale called Chicago for what they are worth. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.